What's up, fight fans? Thank you for tuning in to the War Room. This is your fight goddess. I'm here with my co-host, Malissa Smith and Eddie Goldman. And today we have a very special guest in the house. Eddie, I need you to take it away, brother.
Very good. Thank you. And thanks for everybody being here. While many are still discussing Tyson's Fury defense of his WBC heavyweight belt, less attention is being paid, especially in the boxing media, to the man whom he said is his advisor, Daniel Kinahan. According to promoter Bob Arum, Kinahan is also an advisor to the unbeaten WBO welterweight champ Terrence Crawford, the unbeaten and undisputed 140-pound champ Josh Taylor, and WBO super featherweight champ Jamel Herring. Kinahan was co-founder of what is now the management company MTK Global, although officially it is claimed that he is no longer formally a part of it. Among MTK Global's many dozens of fighters is the unbeaten WBO middleweight champ Savannah Marshall, who appears headed to a showdown next year with two-division unbeaten champ Claressa Shields. So, who is this boxing power broker, Daniel Kinahan? According to the High Court of Ireland, he's a senior figure in organized crime on a global scale and head of the Kinahan Organized Crime Group. Kinahan is now based in Dubai and would likely be arrested on the spot if he were to travel to Ireland, the UK, or the US. To find out more about Kinahan, including his role in boxing, we have as our guest one of the world's leading authorities on the crime world, and especially Irish organized crime, Nicola Tallant. She's the investigations editor for the Sunday World of Ireland, hosts and produced the Crime World podcast, and is author of the wonderful new book, Clash of the Clans, The Rise of the Irish Narcos and Boxing's Dirty Secret. Welcome to the War Room.
Welcome to the War Room.
Nice to be here.
All right, so look, Nicola, that book, it was gripping. I was turning every page, and what fascinates me about that book is when I was 18, I was partying in the Costa del Sol because I was in the military. And fast forward 2010, I knew Jamie Kavanaugh because he was my boxer at the time, was training out of Freddie Roach's gym. So we interviewed Jamie Kavanaugh, and we used to see him every day. So when I was reading that going, oh my God, I know some of the people in this book, it blew me away. So I had to watch or rewatch BBC's Panorama because it gave me the faces to the names that you put in the book, which sounded like, it's a mobster's encyclopedia pretty much. But one of the questions posed to Bob Yellen was, where is this money coming from? This is a company that has 200 plus fighters, right, in their stable. So how does a company like MTK Global, how can they support and finance all of these fighters? Because it's expensive. I managed a fighter. It's very expensive. And when he was asked, Bob Yellen was asked, where does the money come from? He said it comes from a big pot. So now, why is it that there's accounting forensics, cannot figure out where the money comes from? Is that because MTK has not been indicted or accused of a crime? I mean, why is that? We can't find out where this money is coming from.
Well, I suppose you'd have to start with, and by the way, before I start, I'll say to you all here that I am no expert in boxing. My expertise, as your introduction would suggest, is in crime. And I only really came to know a little bit about boxing because of my work in crime. I'm 3 decades working as a crime journalist, and I specialize in organized crime. I follow kind of the larger crime gangs in Ireland and report on that. So this is how I have come to boxing. When you ask why somebody isn't forensically going through MTK accounts, we have to work out who can. And if you look at where they are based, it all goes a bit tricky, or certainly a bit dark, after 2016, 2017, when what I would call the criminal organised crime group, or certainly what the High Court also in Ireland here has called them, had a fallout. And basically, like many very big crime groups or mafias do, they divided in two and they went to war. Behind that is all sorts of allegations of touting, of money going missing, of drugs being seized and everything. But they very spectacularly went to war at a boxing weigh-in in Dublin. And following that, what was at that point MGM, because MTK started out as MGM, was still based in Spain on the Costa del Sol. And what I do know is in September of 2016, that gym was raided by Spanish police. They were investigating a murder. But in the weeks before the raid happened, the MGM financially had become a ghost. It was gone out to the United Arab Emirates, where, as far as I can track it, it moved a lot of its intellectual rights, property rights out to a place called Ras Al Khaimah, which I'm sure I'm probably pronouncing wrong. But that's one of these free trade zones where you're trying to follow the money and journalists can only do a certain amount. Obviously, I don't have access to, banking documents or anything like that. But as far as I could go was out there, and then that's it. Nothing is available publicly, nothing whatsoever. So it gets very complex. And obviously, from what you can see in company accounts as well, you can't see very much, can you? You can see what a company wants you to see. So you'll see a balance sheet with their profits and their assets and that kind of thing. But apart from that, there's very little you can actually see in company accounts. So it's for somebody much higher up than I am in this whole situation to look at this. I mean, we have in Ireland here, we have a branch of the police called the Criminal Assets Bureau, and they were set up to trace criminals' assets. If there was any money here that is seen as the proceeds of crime, it's seized, bank accounts are frozen, properties are taken following a court case. But where do you go with MTK? It's in the United Arab Emirates. As far as I know, there are gyms all over the world, but again, the structure of them is very complex. But I've watched this company grow and change hands, as we've been told, and sold off. And I mean, look, it's very closely linked to Daniel Kinahan. He founded it, he created it, and he has been popping in and out of it, even though we've been told he's nothing to do with it anymore. Every so often he comes forward and he says, yes, he very much does.
Right. And what have you said it would changed hands before? Bob Yellen took over from Sandra Vaughan. Whatever happened to her?
Well, she's still involved there. Danny Vaughan is her husband, and he's one of the chief coaches. I think he's actually based in Dubai now as well.
Everybody moved to Dubai.
Yeah, everybody moved to Dubai. And look, the United Arab Emirates it does appear to be cleaning up its act a little bit at the moment. But when you say you were out in the Costa all those years ago, Dubai kind of became the new Costa. And you can see an awful lot of criminals moving out there, out of reach. There's no arrest warrant between, or no extradition treaty, say, between the likes of Ireland and the Emirates. And the reason being that, if you're in the United Arab Emirates, they do have, funny enough laws, like if you're caught drinking in public or holding hands, you could be charged criminally. And like in a country like Ireland wouldn't agree with that. So we're not going to give anyone back to them if they're going to put them before the courts for having a pint, Right. So they're out of reach there. And Dubai, for anybody who's been or who knows what it's about, it's a melting pot of money. I mean, in the book, I describe the Costa del Sol as that. It's a melting point of cultures and money. And, you have the Russian oligarchs there. You have everybody. It's quite a fascinating
beautiful
place.
City,
really.
Beautiful town.
It's really interesting when you know what you're looking at. Mm-hmm. But the same is the case in the Emirates. And there's been a lot of criminals from all over the world who've sought refuge there. Right. So at the same time, Daniel Kinahan moved from Spain. MGM moved with him as such. And then shortly after that, we were told that he had that Matthew Macklin had sold up. Matthew Macklin would have been his business partner, founding partner. And both of them have stated that publicly, both Macklin and Kinahan. They had sold up entirely to Sandra Vaughan, who appeared to come from nowhere. But actually, if you started peeling back the layers of the onion, she didn't come from nowhere. She was somebody who already knew quite a few people involved in that. She was a fake bake tan guru and had made millions in Scotland, had been, had a slightly colourful past, actually. She'd an ex-partner who had fallen into some bother on the Costa del Sol with the Kinahan mafia and had ended up being rescued by police while he was in the middle of a kidnap, and he had been beaten. He was tied to a bed, actually, when they rescued him.
Crazy.
But yeah, it's a bit crazy, but she did know, I mean, she knew some people. But anyway, she showed up very blonde, very businesslike, a little pink shirt with a pussy bow tie on it, and said she was the new owner of MTK, which it had changed name at that stage. And the reason for that was supposed to be MGM in the States had kind of come after them for the name, for the copyright of the name. So they had changed to MTK. So she said she was the new owner, and then she went to war with the Irish media, and she issued a ban on all Irish media reporting on anything to do with MTK. She said that the Irish media were so unfair to MTK that there was no interviews, and in actual fact, she wasn't going to even sign up another Irish boxer. She was that incensed by the way we insisted on linking her company to Daniel Kinahan. So in other words, she was the first person really who came forward looking to wipe the slate clean and looking to say, there's nothing to see here. But at that point, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was at least 100 boxers on the books, many of whom were still citing Daniel Kinahan as a manager. Many of whom would still tweet advisor. Yeah, no, manager at that stage. He was a manager. They were still using that word. And, you know, many of them were thanking him profusely after fights and things like that for all the help he'd given them. So it was always a bit blurred, the whole thing. A year into this ban on the Irish media, all was forgiven, and everybody was back friends again. And on this situation went until Tyson Fury really blew it up as it was a story that was bigger than Ireland, bigger than the UK, bigger than Europe. Tyson Fury called him out and thanked him for brokering the biggest deal in boxing history, he called it. And I have never believed that was something that Tyson did without sanction.
So you think somebody told him it was okay to say it and then had him delete the tweet or the whatever he posted?
Well, he posted a video which is still available and still used. And I mean, it went, millions of people watched it, and I don't think he deleted it. Maybe he did at one point, but at that point, the cat was out of the bag anyway. But I don't believe for 1 second that Daniel Kinahan was named as the man who brokered that deal without him sanctioning that.
Right.
You know, and what you
saw
after it.
He wants credit for it.
Most definitely. And maybe he does deserve credit for it, because maybe he has brokered it. He probably has. I'm not denying he has. You know, boxing has allowed that happen. What you saw after that was Bob Arum stepping forward and defending him to the hilt. He described him as one of the best guys he'd ever met, and it became almost.
He called him honorable. He called him honorable.
He did.
That's crazy. Bob Arum's come on, Bob. He's a longtime crook though, so you know he's another one. I feel like a lot of legitimate businesses are like the mustache of crime. You know, you've got this legal business, but on the background, you're doing dirty shit. Bob, we see you. That's all I got to say about that. All right. Melissa, you got any questions?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noted in your book is you have a quote from the American mafia guy, Sammy the Bull Gravano, where he's talking about how then John Gotti, who was the New York sort of crime boss of the Colombo family, wanted to get into the boxing world. And, it read to me like a playbook for what Kinahan eventually did, which is start a boxing organization, legitimize it. It becomes a place to funnel basically his drug money into, where does this money come from? But beyond that, I mean, Gravano even talked about how they wanted to buy, at that time, they were negotiating to buy Gleason's Gym. This is in the 1980s, which is a huge brand in the United States and probably globally at this point for a legitimate boxing gym. And what Kinahan did was start MGM in Spain, sort of taking out a little bit of what the monk did in Ireland, in Dublin with the Corinthian Club, and then built it up and built up a solid, clean reputation, if you will. But meanwhile, it's now around the world. You were talking about the murky corporate relationships. They're all individual LLCs in different countries, in different cities. So you need a forensic accountant to sit down and really understand what all of the hierarchies are. And they're also involving themselves with young kids. So with boxing academies and everything else. So from your perspective, what are you seeing here in terms of your long understanding of the place of boxing in the Irish Mafia?
Yeah, I actually, when I discovered that Gravano testimony to the US Senate, I was seriously interested in it because I actually didn't realize it was there for a long time. And it was like a penny dropping for me when I saw it. It was, everything made sense. And you're perfectly right about the Corinthians Boxing Club originally in Dublin here, which was set up by another veteran criminal and very, very well-known criminal here known as the Monk. Jerry the Monk Hutch. And yeah, there's never original ideas though, is there, in the world? I think there've been so many floating around. We always say that in media. We're really just repackaging everything, aren't we? And presenting it in a different way in everything we do. But yeah, I certainly think if you look at what the Gravano was saying, and even down to the detail of, he spoke about how the mob saw it as not just a way to launder and wash their cash, not just a way to sort of, I mean, look, they enjoy boxing for a start, sport. You might as well be laundering your cash through something you're actually interested in. But on top of it, he speaks about how they saw it as a way to meet influential people. And Gravano actually says that they got to meet, or he wanted to meet Trump at the time, through the hotels, etc., that he owned, that they were putting on the boxing matches in. And the same could be said because Daniel Kinahan, while he's in a different part of the world, he has been sort of floating around all these Ekistan places and meeting very powerful people. And in actual fact, following Fury's announcement that he was his advisor, he brokered this fight with Anthony Joshua, which has yet to happen and seems to be in, I can't follow all of that. You mean, you think the drugs world is interesting? My God, everything's in and out. But he, sorry, I've lost the train of thought there now. I was talking about that he was meeting influential people and
to get his foot in the door. That's why Gravano's people wanted to meet Trump, because the ultimate
yes,
goal was to get it to construction.
Exactly. And you have Kinahan out there meeting and sort of, he's legitimized within the world of boxing, and he's it's a fascinating thing to see it. I think the difference is that in Gravano's time, in the mob's time, while they had loads and loads of money, they didn't have drug money back then. They had lots of it, but now the amount of money, there's been a gold rush in cocaine money into Europe in the last 10 years. There's been this perfect storm actually for Kinahan and the growth of his mafia. He has come together with other significant players in the European cocaine market, with the Dutch Moroccans, with the Bosnians, and with the Italian mafia. They have joined forces in order to buy bigger loads of drugs from from Colombia and to ship it in bigger amounts. And it just means that it keeps the costs down for them. They can control the price, and they are estimated to have taken over more than a third of the entire cocaine market in Europe, which is billions and billions. So he's made a fortune. So if, let's just say hypothetically, if Daniel Kinahan has money to wash, and if he was attempting to do that through the boxing world, you'd be seeing the growth of unprecedented terms, bigger probably than the growth would have been if the mob were putting their money in all the way back in the 1980s, because it's just gone crazy. I mean, Kinahan in 2010, when the Spanish police first, the Spanish and other European police first tried to shut down the mob, and they there was a multi-agency aggression against them, which saw a lot of them being arrested, brought before the courts. They were at that point in 2010, now bear in mind that's a decade ago, estimated to be worth more than 100 or 200 million. So they're back in business very quickly after that supposed shutdown, which didn't work for many reasons. And we're 10 years on, and you have just had a situation that, I mean, Europe is coming down under cocaine, and still we haven't reached saturation point. There's talk of Europol are issuing reports year after year saying it's still growing and the problem is just enormous. So, and that's before they move into other markets. That's only the European market. These are a global organization. So he's got a lot of money.
So now he has a war council. He's got literally a drug council like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lasky, and Bugsy Siegel. They did that shit back in the day. Eddie, you have anything you want to ask here? Let's take it to you.
Yeah, in this the simplest terms, aside from the fact that they like boxing, obviously a lot of people like boxing. How does this work with the money laundering? What's the actual process that makes this so important financially for them to be involved in boxing in the way that they are? They just like boxing. They could go to a boxing match, or something like that, but it's obviously much more than that.
But they're the questions that are hanging there, Eddie, to be honest with you. And they're the kind of things that I cannot say categorically what is happening, but I can present facts. And, you can look at the connections that are there. MTK is a business that would say it's doing absolutely nothing wrong. And I know that there is some proceedings happening against this Heredia management in the US, and they have denied all allegations of money laundering. They have denied financial connections with Daniel Kinahan. The most recent outing they had, when they were questioned about it, MTK said that they had no financial entanglement with Daniel Kinahan. They admitted that a number of their boxers were being advised by him, which seems to be a loophole in, within boxing, that you can be an advisor, not a manager. I don't know what the difference is.
You have to have
myself,
a license to be a manager.
Yeah, so he can be an advisor. So they found a way for him to do that. But they are insistent that they are not a criminal operation, that they are a legitimate sports company. And, at various times over the last few years, sometimes they try and distance themselves from Kinahan. Sometimes they come in backing him to the hilt with all the boxers out saying what a good guy he is. So, I couldn't say to you here and now, this is exactly what's happening with the finances, because I simply do not know. I do know that Kinahan's organization is under investigation in a number of jurisdictions. And I do know, and I can tell you, that 60 associates or members of his organization have been jailed here in Ireland for serious charges, many of which are murder. There's been at least 3 or 4 murder cells that have been brought before the courts, and there's multiple convictions from them. There are people in jail in Spain and in the UK. His drugs enterprise has been dismantled here and in the UK, while other European police forces are continuing to work together. They have what they call a final takedown plan. And I do understand that that is in place for the next year or so. The final takedown would be the management, the top structure of the organization.
Wow.
So
they told, I mean,
that's,
how does like, so now Kinahan has a warning that in the next year, his whole business is going to be taken down. They announced that.
well, Kinahan is aware that he's under investigation in that way for a long time. That's why he fled Europe in 2016 and hasn't set foot back here again. He would be confident, actually. Kinahan himself and his circle around him would be confident there's no way they're going to get him because he's bigger than them all. But, you know, in the same way, there's a sort of an inevitability to all these things. You could say, I mean, you look in your own country with Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, whose trial I followed and whose, you know, story was just so incredible, the escapes. And, you know, he was, at one point, he appeared bigger than everything, bigger than the law. And where is he now? He's stuck in solitary confinement in a Brooklyn prison. And
on his way to Supermax. But the question is, you know, since Kinahan has had his refuge in Dubai and in the United Arab Emirates, the question is will there be pressure made to bear by the European Union, by the United States, even by, you know, Colombia, to start to exert pressure for them to give him up, to say, you know, it's really not worth it anymore, because this is starting to, I mean, in your writing, you talk about the impact on just the Irish Republic itself. I mean, to have this incredible murder spree in the middle of Dublin is extraordinary. There is people there are legislators in the Netherlands who are in hiding, right? Who are under police protection because of the reach of the mob. So I'm just curious, from your perspective and from what you've been able to glean in your reporting, do you see that as part of what this picture is?
yeah, I mean, look, after the sort of the big blow up of Tyson Fury and, you know, saying that he was his advisor and all that happened after that, like, bear in mind, Kinahan then announced himself that he was going to work in Bahrain. He was going to head up a sports firm in Bahrain. And very quickly, because of the political pressure put on them, there was a statement issued, and I remember looking at it at the time, and it was issued by the royal family of Bahrain, right? So that's their government, to say there was no way they'd be working with Daniel Kinahan. So he lost that job and any ability to go to Bahrain very quickly after. That would have been, of course, political pressure. So around that time as well, our parliament, our government is called the Dáil, and or then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar actually Taoiseach would be the Prime Minister, got up in the Dáil and stated categorically that they were in conversation, that they had meetings with authorities in the United Arab Emirates, and that they had discussed the situation. It's like anything. It's to bring down the scale and size of the Irish mafia when there began to that global cooperation to bring it down started, was so massive. It's not something you can do overnight. And they do actually have this quite interesting policing plans on how to do it, because you have to remove certain aspects before you can go higher up the rankings. Because if you leave all the hitmen on the street and you take out the boss, the first thing they're going to do is be ordered from prison to go around and kill everybody concerned. So it's a very structured thing. It's not haphazard, while a lot of it is obviously can be a little bit of luck when they have, you know, are good intel rather than luck. You know, they're following a hit team, they're watching, and one of these hit teams in Dublin that they were watching for months on end. They were so chaotic that they kept planning to go and murder this guy, but one of them would go out in the drink and they wouldn't get up in the morning, or they'd miss the lift over to this guy's house. Like, chaotic street soldiers. It's the same across the world. Those guys at the bottom of the rungs are very low IQ, you know, are working for very little. They don't really seem to understand exactly what they're risking when they go out to kill for some of these mafia bosses. But my understanding is that there is a plan. And you see, it's not only an Irish plan. What you have going on in the Netherlands at the moment is, again, something that has taken a long time. They've been trying to dismantle the Macra Mafia, they're called, which is under a guy called Ridwan Taji. And Ridwan Taji was one of Daniel Kinahan's business partners. They met up and lived together down in the Costa del Sol, and they were part of this, what the DEA are calling the European super cartel. So in the Netherlands, you have these trials going on. You have Ridwan Taji behind bars. You have him on trial along with 20 other members of his gang. You have similar investigations going on in Bosnia for their other partners. They're called the Tito and Dino cartel, and they're trying to dismantle them as well. But these are just massive. If you think about it, if you can try and think about it as they're a corporate entity, they are just dealing in an illegal substance, but they are a corporate, big, huge corporate entity that's buying and selling product. So there's a huge amount of staff working for them, you know, and there's a huge amount of areas that need to be dismantled, because otherwise you're going to turn around. If you remove a little bit of it, you'll turn around and you look to your left and you turn back and the weeds are growing again where you pull them. So, you know, you have to go at it in a very structured, proper fashion. I think COVID has delayed a little bit of the final takedown, and probably COVID was a bit of a nightmare for everybody, I think, you know, except of course the criminals who found ways around it and kept bringing the drugs in. But I'd be confident that Kinahan will be brought before the courts here in Ireland.
I hope before my life is over, his ass is dragged into court. But how did you feel about the info wars that came about with these pages popping up to spew, you know, oh, Kinahan's a great guy, blah, blah, blah. How do you feel about the info wars? Because I feel like they took a page out of Putin's propaganda book. I'm ex-Navy, so, you know, that's what it sounds like, looks like to me. But how did you feel about the info wars that was going on between these two websites?
Yeah, I was fascinated with it because I kind of started realizing it was there when I became part of it. And initially one started up, which was kind of from the Kinahan side. There's one side we call the Kinahan faction, the other called the Hutch faction in this war. They were a grouping together until they fell out. So they all knew one another basically. And it made what happened here in Dublin, the feud here in Dublin, even more difficult because it's quite a small city and it's quite compact in the center of it. And you had two groupings going to war who knew everything about one another. So they all knew each other's mothers and fathers. They'd probably been to one another's houses. They knew the routines. They knew everything about each other. So it was a nightmare really from a policing point of view. But it started shortly after that shooting at the Way in the Regency Hotel attack, which would have been an attempt on the life of Daniel Kinahan, which didn't work out quite that way, but a very senior lieutenant of his called David Byrne was murdered. Kinahan got away, and thus started the retaliation, which resulted in 18 murders in a very quick period of time. But very quickly after that, these anonymous Twitter sites started up, giving out information, sort of what looked like, you know, some of it you could see was nonsense, but some of it was really very close to the bone, and information that wasn't in the public arena, like information that was part of Garda investigations or that maybe just journalists might know or whatever. And I got thrown into the middle of it, got called out at one stage. So I kind of, what is this exactly? And when I had a look at it, I realized that it was a platform or a forum that was certainly inciting violence. It was, who was it talking to? It wasn't really talking to the general public, even though it was a public platform. It was talking to journalists. It was trying to it was basically trying to direct the narrative. And a lot of the narrative was, if a certain person gets killed, this will be the end of the feud. But it seemed to me that they wanted that in print in a national newspaper or coming from a journalist. They didn't want it coming from this anonymous site. They wanted to try and get that in to the media and as a piece of information, source information for crime journalists. And crime journalists, you have to remember, do operate on this very peculiar world where we have to meet people in odd places. We have to constantly be aware that a lot of people talking to us shouldn't be talking to us and could get killed for talking to us. We have to speak to other individuals who are maybe working and can't be seen to be talking. So a lot of, there's a lot of work done in the shadows anyway, you know. But in recent times, because of a lot of encrypted communication, people are a lot more comfortable talking to you through that. And you can understand that because it lowers the risk of them being seen with you. But at the same time, from our point of view, it completely lowers our abilities to work out where they're coming from, which is super important because everybody comes to you with a piece of information, has an agenda. I mean, there's no point of being naive about it. They have an agenda. They either want this guy down the road to be raided by the police and have his drug stash taken from him. They might want, at the worst case scenario, they want somebody to be killed because a piece of information will be that loaded that if it's put out, it'll have them killed. Or they might just not like the other guy. And that's kind of, I'm fine with that. You know, if the piece of information is true, if I can back it up with other sources, I'm okay with that. If they just don't like somebody, that's just okay. But with this, you were missing who these people were. You didn't have a clue where they were coming from. You gather which side they were coming from, but you didn't really know. So you were kind of blind. He was passing out pieces of information that a journalist would have been blind with. Now, some of the stuff did get into the media. I was watching it very closely and I could see it kind of filtering through. But a criminal investigation actually started into it, into this site, and it kind of quickly shut down. I think whoever was behind it realized they were being investigated. Maybe maybe they got fed up, whatever. But a similar thing then kicked off on the other side, called the Whistleblower. And that was a site, a Twitter site that was like, it was literally, some of the stuff again was ridiculous nonsense and just sort of having a go at somebody's looks or maybe their weight gain or something like this, a rival criminal, obviously. But some of it was actually really deep intel that was held within the guards, that was scenarios that had happened, fallouts that had happened that nobody knew of. So it was very clear that this was somebody who is now rivaling the Kinahan organization, but who had the secrets of it. And that's why I say to you that these two groups that went to war were once together and knew everything about one another. So you could see, but I just think it's modern. It's just the modern crime world that, you know, if we look at organizations like ISIS, they've used propaganda. They've very much used, they have their own propaganda wings. And a drug gang, yeah, and videos and all this sort of stuff, and they put it out and they have their Twitter sites and everything. But if you actually look at that and you sort of put it into an organized crime gang, they've so much money. Of course, they can afford to have a PR division of their corporate entity. They have a marketing division, and this is actually what it is. But it's really important, I think, for crime journalists in particular to be aware that that is a thing. So if you're seeing this information, it's probably not just from an interested underling who feels that this information should come to the fore. There's never any good really in the reasons behind people from the criminal underworld doing anything. So it's very important journalistically that we are aware that these are narratives they're trying to feed through the mainstream media.
So you, in other words, you have to be extremely discerning. But you also talk in your book about how, you know, switching now to the legitimate side, if you will, with MGM prior to MTK, having a relationship with IFL TV, and in terms of reporting on their boxing, which then gives positive spin to the organization. So you've got, on the one hand, feeding information to journalists in sort of nefarious ways to try to disguise intentions, but then you have this whole PR plan on the legitimate side to try to keep things afloat that way. Is that something you're seeing across things besides the boxing business for the Kinahans?
Well, I certainly don't know of them investing in media, if that's what you mean, but I thought that was very interesting what happened with that IFL TV thing, if you looked at that, because there was somebody. So if you go back to Tyson Fury and before he was signed in with Daniel Kinahan, I mean, his former manager, Ben Davison, clearly states that Tyson he was at his lowest ebb when Kinahan came in and saved him, plucked him from what was going to be oblivion and put him back into a training program which has resulted in, I mean, nobody can say it's anything but a miracle what's happened with Tyson Fury. It is an amazing thing to see somebody who was that unhealthy, unfit, and all the rest of it come back and do what he's done. But he was at a very low ebb. And Davison says that Tyson was not only at a low ebb, kind of from mental health point of view, but he was also financially at a low ebb. And he was in debt and he owed this and he had court cases and everything. And Kinahan sorted that all out for him. And I reckon that you could be amazed what getting your finances would sort for your mental health. You know, it's just the way it is. You have very high stresses like that. And, you know, it's really hard and stressful. And the same was the way in the IFL TV. Coogan Cassius, who was running it, had said himself, and he has spoken about this, that, you know, this was his dream to have this, and he'd been going around and trying to stay in hotels and trying to find the money to put himself up so as he could cover all these boxing events all over England. And he was even having difficulty practically putting the petrol in the car to get there. So he was really about to throw in the towel, wasn't he? I mean, he couldn't make the thing work financially for himself. And sure enough, at that point, Kinahan and Macklin come in and they offer him a sponsorship deal. And all of a sudden, he's got access to all the MGM fighters. He's probably, you know, you get a sponsorship deal, you get better equipment, you get better everything, don't you? And you get paid.
Yep.
So, you know, you can't blame any of these people for doing what they did or for taking the money. It's just, for me, the whole thing is, I think boxing itself as a sport has to look at itself and how it just doesn't seem to be regulated properly. And I'm not naive enough to think that other sports haven't been hit up by criminal. I think football as well is concerned about the amount of investment in it. But the fact of the matter is that boxing just seems to have every loophole there is. And there's an acceptability, a historic acceptability that your criminals are really just tough guys in the ring. And that's all fine too, until you look at exactly what you said, Melissa, earlier about the kids. Because I don't know about the US, but here in Ireland, boxing clubs are in very working class areas. I know lots of kids who have got involved in boxing, and it has disciplined them and helped them just through that period of time in their teenage years when they could go one way or the other. And they found mentors, they found good mentors, good people. One good adult can bring a child to adulthood themselves. And I think that's why it's important that those clubs and that sport should be protected, because there's no kids in working class Dublin anyway playing hockey or, you know, other sports like that, rugby. It's, you know, sports here are very much class related, you know, and boxing is very much popular, and they can connect with it, the kids. And you've got these guys looming around. And as far as I'm concerned, these gang bosses, these drug bosses are operating like pedophiles. They recognize the vulnerable kids. They observe them, they stand back, and then they move in, and they will bring them in to hold drugs for them, to do this for them, to do that for them. And it's exactly the same as that. And if you have people involved in boxing who are also involved in organized crime, knocking around these clubs where you're hoping to bring kids into adulthood, you've got a problem.
Yeah, I agree, especially since, you know, it's one thing when you're in a little seedy club in the middle of nowhere, you know, or in a small city. But when the kind of clubs that MTK are providing are these really high-end, fancy places with lots of money, that seems to just materialize. And the boxers that they have get lots of money, but there's no understanding of what they're giving back in the percentage of their purses. Is it 5%, 10%, 100%? We really have no transparency. And now they're moving into women's boxing, which has historically been, at the bottom end of the barrel, if you will, and suddenly there are opportunities um, for some high level fights. So you have Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing with some very excellent females, undisputed champions such as Katie Taylor, who in terms of Ireland is just the queen of sport, and thought of as a clean person in sport and projects that image. And yet surrounding her is all this other stuff. And now you have MTK signing champions such as Chantel Cameron, Savannah Marshall, who Eddie Goldman brought up earlier. And and then the question is, how do we project what this is going to mean for these women as they join these kind of organizations, because they're being given care and feeding in a way that they have never been given in the past. They are not necessarily, they are also a lot of them are working class girls who came up through sports organizations in their own countries. And what is going to then happen to our on this desire on the one hand for, $1 million purses for these kinds of fights, but with folks like MTK really fueling some of that, one has to question motives and what the impact is going to be on sport in general. And then, as I said, this patina of women on top of it.
And your problem is that if you have drug money there, if you do, and again, we have to state that we just know the connections between MTK and Daniel Kinahan. But if you have one grouping, shall we say, in any sort of a competitive world that just have way more money than anyone else, you can forget it. They'll crush them. So it just, there's been a couple of, boxing managers and companies who have basically suggested that they've been put out of business because they cannot compete. There's absolutely no way they can pay the money, because it's just not actually, if you sit down with your maths, it's not possible to pay some of this money that's been paid. I mean, I've been speaking to people all over the country here who have told me that some of them have been approached by MTK and they haven't gone with it. But my God, is it tempting, And obviously all eyes here on Jessica Harrington, our boxer who won at the Olympics, and she isn't going professional yet, but everybody's kind of watching her. She's a lovely, wholesome, really great girl, working class girl. She's a cleaner in a hospital, and just really down to earth, and everything a boxer should be and everything the sport should be. And it seems that there's this poison out there waiting for so many of them. And it's all really about greed, isn't it? And it's all about the money.
And none of the regulatory bodies, quote unquote, in boxing are doing anything about it. You had this situation recently in the UK where Eddie Hearn pulled Matchroom from Sky Sports to go purely in the UK and Ireland streaming on DAZN. And a lot of people felt, well, that was the end of Sky Sports boxing, just like HBO in the US finished with it. Instead, you have all these new promotions coming up, like Boxer, and all of a sudden, all these MTK Glow fighters are on Sky Sports, and they have a full boxing program. And yet you have the British Boxing Board of Control. What are they doing about it? You had Tyson Fury, who we mentioned earlier, fighting in Las Vegas. You have the Nevada State Athletic Commission. What are they doing about any of this? And the only thing that seems to be happening is an individual lawsuit. You mentioned the Heredia management lawsuit, because they're claiming that MTK poached fighter Jojo Diaz, who is still under contract to them, and they claim that MTK gets the money because it's laundered drug money, so they're able to entice a young, undefeated, rising prospect like Diaz to go to them. They're saying he's still under contract to them. They of course have denied all this, and it's still going through the lengthy court process. But you had the California State Athletic Commission there too. What are they? Nobody's doing anything about it. There was one mentioned towards the end of the the BBC Panorama documentary. And if people haven't seen that, I really recommend it. Somebody posted it on YouTube, not the BBC, but it's still up on YouTube, that the US DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, is investigating this whole situation. But so far, if that's true, that still in the investigation stage. And as many people have said, boxing is, there's no central regulatory body. You couldn't imagine this happening in almost any other sport, the exceptions, I think, being MMA and kickboxing. But in just about any other sport that you could name, they wouldn't allow this because one of the big sponsors or the networks would say, no, we're not having this. But instead, they're expanding the reach of these people all over the place. And it's a very dire situation. At the same time, it hurts boxing overall because the whole sport just declines year in and year out, more so than just, the pandemic, as you said, hurt everybody. But this is something different. The sport has been in serious decline, spiraling downhill for the last several decades. And now you have this coming up. What is Sky going to do, which is now part of the U.S. corporation Comcast, which owns NBC and which is also the Olympics broadcaster in the U.S.? Are they going to continue with this? Is somebody going to say, no, we're going to pull the plug on this? We don't know. We don't know where this is headed, but it's really not good for anybody except MTK Global.
Yeah, and look, for journalists are there to maybe shake the tree a bit. I mean, that's all we can do. And after that, it's up to politicians, it's up to the police, it's up to obviously boxing's regulatory bodies to get together, or, the advertisers that buy advertising and sponsor these shows, for people to I don't know, to vote with their wallet and stop, refuse to buy these channels or whatever. But you can't change the world. It's just, I agree with you totally. I think boxing is in a dire place. There seems to be an awful lot of good people who adore boxing, and I've spoken to so many of them. And, they keep sort of saying, well, what can we do? What can we do? And it's like, I've kind of done what I can. There's not much more I could literally do. I have literally laid it bare. This is what's happened. These are who these people are. These are these people that are being called out as the good guys. And yet nothing happens. So, I mean, I don't know. There doesn't seem to be any will. There doesn't seem to be any will there for anybody to do anything about it. It just, to me, it just seems to go on and nobody bats an eyelid. And interestingly, it was one aspect of what was happening here really for the last 5 years, because it took a while for this story of Kinahan and the links to MTK to become global, It didn't happen immediately. We knew about it from, I remember in 2012, looking down the ramp into the first MGM gym in Costa del Sol and wondering what it was. Was it just a bit of a gym for the boys, because they always sort of had a gym and a breakfast place to go to afterwards? And, but so I've watched it grow and I've watched everybody ignore it. And, Sky just seemed to be able to issue a statement saying, everybody seems to say, but he's no convictions, but he's no this, he's no that. Everybody just comes up with that. It's a very easy thing to say. There's plenty of people who went to their graves without convictions and weren't good people, or weren't people with morals that we should have been engaged with in any way, shape or form. And I don't believe Kinahan will go to his grave without that. I'm just pointing that out, I just think there's too much money involved. There's too many people earning too much money. I can tell you that from people mixed up with Kinahan in the boxing world. I did have a very interesting conversation with somebody, I have to be vague, just to protect them basically, but somebody that would be close to all of it. And what they said was that a lot of people have become so entangled with Kinahan that they can't detangle themselves. They're afraid of him. And they would love if the police would come in, arrest him, and put him in prison, because it would solve all their problems. And then they could continue and just say, oh, it was just him. Wasn't it? You know?
Right.
You know, I'm
Yeah.
sure then actually it would suit everyone. I'm sure then Sky could say, well,
They could go.
he's gone now. And yeah,
Yeah, he's
everyone
gone
could
now.
go few. Everyone could go few. So, you know, it actually kind of made me laugh a little bit that everybody, where a lot of people around him in boxing who are making a lot of money were kind of waiting and willing for to see the police lift him out of it. You kind of wish that they'd leave him alone for another while and let them stew on the problems
Like-
that are theirs of their own making.
So be careful what you wish for in terms of financial support.
Yeah.
You might get it. Listen, as late as last night, Jojo Diaz, who fought on a DAZN card in the United States, won his fight over a fighter named Mikey Garcia, and he was called out by Kevin Haney, who's a boxer managed by Eddie Hearn. And the response Diaz said was, contact MTK Global. Let's do it. So,
Right.
you know, he could ride just as easily said, contact Danny Kinahan.
Exactly. Look, this story is, I mean, I am firmly convinced that I'll be getting on to part 2 eventually when I dust
Right.
myself down, because in a way, this story is, you know, there's more than a final chapter left in it. There's a lot left in it.
Just getting
Uh,
started.
it'll-
Just getting
yeah.
started. Well, when you're ready to
Exactly.
come back for part 2, we want to have you here.
Okay.
And tell us about also, I found a very humorous part to this otherwise unhumorous story where you had to sort of dress up as a criminal to investigate in Spain some of the goings on and the layout there that's detailed in the book. I found that kind of funny. If they ever make this into a movie, that'll probably be one of the funniest parts.
Have you been approached
Well,
about this being your book, Clash of the Clans, becoming a film?
Well, it's just literally out. It's only out here, like it's only gone on sale here in the last couple of weeks. So I'm just sort of seeing how that goes. It's actually gone straight in as number 2 in the nonfiction here in Ireland, which is brilliant in the first week.
Right.
So that's unprecedented. But yeah, everybody, I mean, actually, funny enough, you should say that, Eddie. Like, okay, there's boxing and you've got organized crime, and then I'm a female reporter working in the middle of it, and it's sort of a lot of women who like crime sort of don't really like gangland crime. They just prefer sort of, you know, I don't know, I won't call it regular crime, but anyways, they just find it all a bit rough and tumble. So in a way, what I tried to do was put a little bit of myself into it as well, a little bit of my own experiences. I think people are always fascinated by how do crime journalists do their job. And this huge big ball of secrecy has actually come up around it. And actually, we do our jobs quite ridiculously in many ways. And that incident in Spain, when I was sort of trying to look as if I had lots of money from my drug dealing ventures with my drugs, I was trying to be basically a drug dealer's mall, I think. That's just one of the ways. I always say, like, when it comes to reporting on this stuff, there's many ways of skinning a cat. There's plenty of ways of trying to get to the heart of the story, really, and the information. So I hope it was enjoyable anyway.
It was.
Yeah, it was, and I
Go ahead. Ed,
yes,
sorry.
I recommend everybody get this book. I hope they make outside of Ireland the print edition available too, because on Amazon it's just on a Kindle edition. And I think we're going to nominate you for what it's worth for our boxing journalist of the year, even though it's more about organized crime. It's so totally intertwined with boxing. The title Clash of the Clans was not only about the Kinahan and Hutch feud and all the other feuds going on, but that was also the name of the show that was supposed to take place when the Regency Hotel murder took place and that whole chaos. That was the name of the card, and that card, of course, was canceled. So there's just it's interconnected. I think we can call this. It's such a great nonfiction book, but it's also in large part a boxing book. And I haven't seen anything in terms of books like this in media. I think maybe the BBC Panorama show, which also, by the way, I don't think was ever shown in the United States. As I recall, they showed BBC Panorama in the United States a couple of weeks later on BBC World News, but I don't think they ever aired that episode. I couldn't ever find it here. So somebody had to put a bootleg copy up on YouTube, because unless you're in the UK, you can't get BBC One or Two, which it was on. So so keep them coming, because you're not seeing too much of this stuff at all. There have been people in the boxing media talking about it, a handful in the US. Kurt Emhoff, who was quoted, you quoted him in the book. He was in the BBC Panorama show. Wally Matthews wrote about this. I've done a couple of things on this with Declan Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with him, the investigative journalist who's now a professor at University of New Haven. There's been a little bit of stuff, but not a whole lot. And it's not something, I didn't see anybody discuss it when after the Fury Wilder fight, and everybody in boxing was discussing that fight and Fury. I didn't see any mention of the situation with Kinahan.
Well, I suppose, as it says on the you know, on the front of it, it's the dirty little secret, isn't it?
Mhm.
It's boxing's dirty little
Open
secret. That's
secret.
exactly what it is.
Yep.
It's an
Yep.
open secret. All right, my beautiful people, if you guys don't have anything else for the very talented Nicola Tallant, then we are going to wrap this show up. It has been a wonderful time. We've enjoyed our time with you, Nicola. I can't wait for part 2. And like I said, if you come to LA to talk to any producer here about producing this as a film, I will gladly be your bodyguard.
Okay, great.
Because you
That's
need
brilliant
one.
to have that. It's great to have that squared.
Okay, that's awesome. So look, we're going to wrap this up, people. You guys have a beautiful day, and we are out. Peace.